clay jar, roughly 13 centimeters tall, sits in a climate-controlled drawer in Baghdad's National Museum. Inside it, a copper cylinder soldered along one seam, an iron rod suspended through an asphalt seal, and traces of something acidic that stained the metal green over 2,000 years ago. In 1978, researchers at the British Science Museum built an exact replica, filled it with vinegar, and measured voltage between the copper and the iron. The reading was small, less than 2 volts, but it was steady, repeatable, and it came from an object pulled out of Parthian-era soil near Baghdad. How does a civilization forget to explain something it clearly knew how to build? That question has hovered quietly over this artifact since 1938, when a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König examined it and suggested carefully, almost reluctantly, that it might be a galvanic cell. A battery. His colleagues offered other words: ritual vessel, scroll container, neutral labels for something that made the ancient world harder to organize into neat lines. Tonight we'll follow 3 traces left in the soil of Mesopotamia objects that function in ways the Bronze Age wasn't supposed to allow, text that described them with strangely technical precision, and a flood layer 8 feet thick that divides what we know from what we may have forgotten. This is the story of a Sumerian artifact the ancient world never quite explained. The jar was found in 1936 at Kujut Rabu, a modest site just southeast of Baghdad. It lay among domestic objects, oil lamps, grain vessels, clay tablets, recording everyday transactions. Nothing ceremonial, nothing grand. The kind of assemblage you'd expect from a workshop or a household storeroom, and yet the construction of this one vessel speaks to something beyond the everyday. The copper sheet inside had been rolled and soldered with controlled precision. Its wall thickness holds steady at roughly 1 millimeter throughout. You could run a fingertip along the interior and feel how even it is. The iron rod hangs centered in the cylinder, held by asphalt positioned so it never touches the copper walls. Every element serves a function. Remove any one of them, the cylinder, the rod, the acidic liquid, and the electrical effect vanishes. The design is not random. It is by any careful reading optimized. But optimized for what and by whom? These are the questions that make this small jar uncomfortable for the standard narrative of human progress, the one where knowledge accumulates steadily, generation by generation tool, A leading to tool B, each century a little brighter than the last. The copper and clay vessel is not alone in its awkwardness. Across Mesopotamian collections in London, Berlin, Baghdad, other small objects share the same quality of not quite fitting. A piece of rock crystal recovered by Austin Henry Laird at Nimrud in the 1850s, ground into a smooth curve tested under modern instruments and found to focus light at a focal length of 11 centimeters, with magnification up to 3 times, the deviation from an ideal spherical surface less than half a millimeter across the entire face. That level of precision suggests not decorative polishing, but deliberate optical work, or at the very least some researchers argue it does. Then there are the drill holes. Diorite vessels from Sumerian sites show perfectly cylindrical bores cut into stone that ranks 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than any bronze tool available in the 3rd millennium BC. When Flinders Petrie measured similar marks in Egyptian granite during the 1880s, he calculated penetration rates that required by his estimate roughly a ton of downward pressure. Modern experimental archaeology has tried to replicate those marks with reconstructed ancient tools. The results come close, but not quite close enough. Something in the technique remains unaccounted for. Each of these objects, the jar, the lens, the drill marks, could be discussed in isolation, catalogued with cautious language, and filed under anomalous. And for decades that is essentially what happened. Museum labels read vessel of unknown purpose or decorative implement. The objects were stored, not studied, acknowledged, not integrated. What makes them harder to set aside is the pattern. The copper and clay configuration appears in multiple examples with consistent construction methods. The crystal lenses turn up at different sites ground to similar specifications. The precision drilling recurs across hundreds of stone vessels, all displaying the same machining characteristics. Someone across considerable stretches of time and geography was repeating these techniques, and repetition implies transmission knowledge passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, perhaps encoded in the very systems the Sumerians used to organize their world. Their mathematical system was base 60. It appears in the earliest records already mature, already woven into astronomical observation and timekeeping. We still carry fragments of it 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees, without most of us pausing to wonder where it came from. Their language Sumerian belongs to no known linguistic family. Its surfaces fully formed around 3200 BC, with complex grammar and specialized vocabulary as though inherited rather than assembled from scratch. Their scribal schools copied and recopied technical texts for centuries, preserving knowledge in a language that had long ceased to be spoken, the way a vessel preserves the shape of whatever once filled it. And their own tradition offers a curious self-description. The Sumerians did not call their knowledge new, they called it restored. The Emi, their word for the codes and formulas of civilization, were described as gifts recovered after a great catastrophe, after a flood that swept the previous world away. In 1929, Leonard Woolley's team at found physical evidence of such an event 8 feet of sterile river silt lying beneath the ruins, separating one layer of human habitation from another like a blank page torn from the middle of a book. Whether those ancient descriptions preserve literal memory or symbolic meaning may not be something we can settle, but we can hold the question gently, the way you might hold a small clay jar in dim light, and feel the weight of something intended, something built with a logic that still, after all these centuries, produces a measurable result when you add vinegar and weight. So we begin where the evidence begins, not with answers, but with the objects themselves pulled from the dry ground of a southern Iraq, wrapped in cloth shipped across oceans, and left to wait in numbered drawers for someone willing to look a little more closely. The jar at Küçük. In the summer of 1936, a railway construction crew working southeast of Baghdad broke through a layer of compacted earth near the village of Küçük. The ground there had been disturbed before centuries of settlement, and resettlement had layered the soil into a compressed archive of human activity. But what the workers uncovered was not a foundation or a wall. It was a collection of small objects, clay vessels and metal fragments, resting in a stratum associated with the Parthian period, roughly 250 BC. Among them was a terracotta jar, pale and unremarkable, about the size of a man's fist. It was sent along with dozens of other finds to the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, where it was catalogued and placed in storage. The jar might have stayed there indefinitely, one of thousands of similar vessels lining the shelves of the museum's lower floors. But it caught the attention of Wilhelm König, a German archaeologist serving as the museum's assistant director. König was not looking for anything extraordinary. He was conducting a routine survey of Parthian-era artifacts, sorting through the material that accumulates in any large excavation, pottery shards, corroded tools, fragments of daily life that help reconstruct how ordinary people lived 2 millennia ago. What made him pause was not the jar itself, but what he found inside it. The vessel contained a copper cylinder rolled from a single sheet of metal and soldered along a vertical seam. The cylinder fit snugly within the clay walls as though it had been measured and shaped for this specific container. A copper disc sealed the bottom, also soldered into place. At the top, an asphalt plug, the same natural bitumen used across Mesopotamia for waterproofing boats and lining canals, closed the opening. And through that plug, positioned carefully at the centre, ran a thin iron rod. The rod did not touch the copper walls. It hung suspended in the interior space, held in alignment by the asphalt seal, alone, reaching down into the hollow cylinder like a finger pointing at something invisible. König turned the assembly over in his hands. The iron was corroded, but not evenly. The rust concentrated in bands along the lower portion of the rod, the section that would have been submerged if the vessel had been filled with liquid to a certain level. The copper cylinder's interior showed patches of green oxidation, copper acetate, the kind of patina that forms when copper is exposed to acidic solutions over time. The staining was heaviest near the bottom and along the inner walls, distributed in a pattern that suggested not single exposure but repeated contact. Filling and draining. Filling and draining. König had studied enough chemistry to recognize what he was looking at. Two dissimilar metals, copper and iron, separated by a small gap, enclosed in a vessel designed to hold liquid. If that liquid were acidic vinegar, fermented fruit juice, even sour wine, the configuration would produce a galvanic reaction, an electrochemical cell, in simpler terms a battery. He measured the components. The copper cylinder's wall thickness held consistent at roughly 1 millimeter throughout its length. The iron rod was centered with a precision that left approximately equal space on all sides between it and the copper wall. The proportions of the assembly, the ratio of cylinder diameter to height, the length of the rod, relative to the interior volume, followed a logic that seemed less like chance and more like calculation. Every element served a role. The sealed bottom prevented leakage. The asphalt plug insulated the top while anchoring the rod. The gap between metals ensured they would not short-circuit through direct contact. Remove any single component and the design loses coherence. Koenig published his observations cautiously. He did not claim certainty. He proposed that objects like these might represent an ancient form of galvanic cell, possibly used for electroplating coating base metals, with thin layers of gold or silver. The technique was known in Mesopotamia. Gilded objects from the period exist in museum collections. But the method by which that gilding was achieved had never been satisfactorily explained. Fire gilding with mercury was one possibility, but it left characteristic traces that not all gilded objects showed. Electroplating would explain the anomaly, but electroplating required electricity, and electricity required a source. The archaeological community received Koenig's proposal with the kind of quiet that is louder than objection. A few scholars offered alternative interpretations. The vessel was a scroll container, perhaps the copper lining meant to protect papyrus from moisture. The iron rod was structural, a support for rolled documents. The asphalt seal was simply good craftsmanship standard. Mesopotamian waterproofing applied to a storage jar. These explanations accounted for the individual components, but not for the specific way they were combined. The deliberate separation of metals, the sealed and fillable interior, the corrosion patterns consistent with acidic use rather than passive burial. Koenig's hypothesis did not vanish, but it did not flourish either. It drifted into the margins of Mesopotamian scholarship, cited occasionally in footnotes, revisited in popular science articles, but never fully integrated into the academic understanding of ancient technology. The jar remained in Baghdad, and the question it raised whether Bronze Age or post-Bronze Age craftsmen understood something about the relationship between metals, acids and electrical potential remained unanswered, not refuted, not confirmed. Simply set aside the way inconvenient objects are set aside when they do not match the story a discipline has agreed to tell. But Koenig's jar was not alone, and the pattern it belonged to had been accumulating quietly for nearly a century before he ever opened that storage drawer. The traces were scattered across dig sites from Nimrud to Uruk, catalogued under vague labels stored in museum basements, from London to Berlin, each one a small stubborn thing that did not quite fit. To see that pattern, we need to step back not forward in time, but outward in geography to the ruins where British and French excavators first broke ground in the river valleys of southern Iraq, expecting to find the crude beginnings of civilization, and finding instead something that made them uneasy. What the spades found? First, the first cylinder seal pulled from Mesopotamian soil weighed less than 30 grams. It was small enough to roll between two fingers carved from a piece of stone no larger than a wine cork. Yet pressed into wet clay, it produced a continuous band of imagery. Figures, animals, the celestial symbols with a precision that suggested not a craftsman learning his trade, but one who had already mastered it. British excavators in the mid-19th century collected these seals by the hundreds. Each one was a signature, a proof of identity and authority, a concept that requires institutional trust, legal abstraction, and a shared belief in the permanence of record. The Mesopotamians had all three before most of the world had writing. Austin Henry Layard arrived at Nimrud in 1845 with expectations shaped by the classical world. He had studied Greek and Roman ruins, understood the arc of Mediterranean civilization, and assumed that what lay beneath the mounds of northern Iraq would represent something earlier and cruder, the rough drafts of a culture still finding its voice. What his teams uncovered was not rough. The palace walls at Nimrud bore carved reliefs of astonishing detail battle scenes, hunting processions, tributary delegations depicted with anatomical accuracy and spatial depth. The stonework was confident accomplished, produced by artisans working within a mature tradition. But Layard's most quietly significant find was not monumental. It was a small oval of polished rock crystal, roughly 4 centimetres along its longest axis, recovered from a chamber in the northwest palace. One face was flat, the other had been ground into a smooth, deliberate curve. It was catalogued and shipped to the British Museum, along with crates of larger, more dramatic artefacts, the winged bulls, the carved panels, the pieces that would fill gallery halls and draw Victorian crowds. The crystal went into storage. It waited there for over a century before anyone thought to test what it could do. When modern researchers examined the Nimrud lens under controlled conditions, they found that its curved surface produced a focal length of approximately 11 centimetres. It could magnify objects up to 3 times their apparent size. Interferometric measurement, a technique that maps surface geometry with extraordinary accuracy, revealed that the curvature deviated from a perfect spherical arc by less than 0.5 millimetre across the entire face. The polishing marks were consistent with hand abrasion using fine powder, yet the overall shape was not the product of random grinding. It was deliberate, controlled, optically functional. The standard interpretation is that the object was decorative and inlay for furniture perhaps, or a piece of ornamental jewellery, and that interpretation may be correct, but it leaves a residue of discomfort, because decorative inlays do not require precise focal lengths. They do not need to focus light. They do not need curvature calculated to a mathematical relationship between surface radius and the point at which light converges. This small crystal does all of those things. The detail is modest, almost easy to overlook, but it does not resolve itself into simplicity no matter how long you study it. Layard was not the only excavator to encounter objects that exceeded expectation. Farther south at Leonard Woolley's, campaigns in the 1920s and 1930s revealed a city of startling completeness. The royal cemetery yielded golden headdresses, lapis lazuli jewellery and lyres decorated with bull heads cast in copper and gold. These were spectacular finds, the kind that fill museum brochures. But beneath the spectacle lay something more quietly remarkable: the infrastructure. Woolley's team documented drainage systems engineered with consistent gradients, ensuring water flowed in one direction without pooling. They found temple foundations aligned to true north, with an accuracy that implied astronomical observation. They uncovered administrative archives, tens of thousands of clay tablets, recording grain inventories, labour contracts, legal disputes, and tax assessments in a bureaucratic system of striking sophistication. The mathematics embedded in those tablets presented its own puzzle. Sumerian scribes worked in base 60, a sexagesimal system that appeared in the earliest records already complete. They divided the circle into 360 degrees. They split the hour into 60 minutes. They performed calculations involving square roots, geometric ratios, and what we now call the Pythagorean relationship, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. These were not tentative experiments scrawled by students discovering arithmetic. They were standardized procedures copied and recopied in scribble schools that treated mathematical knowledge as inherited curriculum rather than active research. And that word inherited surfaces again and again when you spend time with Sumerian material. The civilization does not present itself as a culture in the process of invention. It presents itself as a culture in the process of maintenance, preserving what it already possessed, transmitting what it had received. The scribble schools did not teach students to innovate. They taught students to copy accurately and completely texts that were already ancient by the time the students held a stylus. Some researchers see this as conservatism, the natural tendency of bureaucratic cultures to resist change. Others see something else, a system designed to prevent loss, as though the knowledge it carried had been lost once before, and the culture that rebuilt it was determined not to let that happen again. Between the crystal lens in London and the administrative tablets in Baghdad, a quiet pattern emerges. The objects suggest precision, the texts suggest preservation, and the gap between what these artifacts demonstrate and what the conventional timeline expects remains open, not because evidence is missing, but because the evidence that exists does not settle comfortably into the framework built to contain it. Some scholars note this discomfort and move on. Others pause at it the way you might pause at a door that opens onto a room larger than the building that holds it. What neither group can easily dismiss is the physical record left behind in stone, not in tablets or crystal, but in the drill marks found on some of the hardest material the ancient world ever tried to shape. Those marks tell a story of their own, and it is a story that begins not with what the Sumerians wrote, but with what they cut. The marks that should not be there. Diorite is not a forgiving stone. It is dense, crystalline, and ranks 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than steel, harder than any bronze or copper tool available to Mesopotamian craftsmen. To work diorite by hand is an exercise in patience measured not in hours but in weeks. Every cut resists. Every surface must be ground slowly, abrasively, grain by grain. The ancient Sumerians knew this. They chose diorite anyway. They carved it into vessel statues and ceremonial objects with a confidence that suggests either extraordinary determination or access to methods we have not yet fully understood. The vessels are what draw the most uncomfortable attention. Hundreds of diorite bowls, vases and containers have been recovered from Sumerian and Akkadian period sites across southern Iraq. Many are displayed in museums, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Iraq Museum, where visitors admire their symmetry and smooth finish without pausing to consider what that finish required. But when researchers examine these vessels under magnification, the admiration shifts to something closer to confusion. The drill holes are the problem. Some vessels show cylindrical bores several inches deep cut into the interior, with a regularity that appears almost mechanical. The walls of these holes are smooth, the diameter consistent from top to bottom with no wobble, no taper, no variation that would indicate a tool slipping or a hand losing control. Concentric grooves line the interior surfaces, parallel striations that spiral downward, suggesting the drill rotated at a steady speed while advancing into the stone under constant pressure. These are not the marks of a craftsman wrestling with resistant material. They are the marks of a controlled process, something systematic and repeatable. In the 1880s, decades before Koenig examined his clay jar in Baghdad, the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie encountered similar anomalies in Egypt. Petrie was meticulous, a man who measured everything, who believed that careful quantification could reveal what narrative could not. During his surveys of granite and diorite artifacts from the Giza Plateau and surrounding sites, he extracted core samples from drill holes and examined them under magnification. What he found unsettled him. The spiral grooves inside the cores indicated that the drill had descended into granite at a rate that seemed far too fast for copper tools, working against stone of that hardness. Petrie calculated that reproducing such penetration rates would require roughly a ton of downward pressure, a force difficult to achieve with the hand-operated bow drills that conventional reconstructions of ancient technology propose. Petrie published his findings carefully, noting the discrepancy without insisting on a specific explanation. He was a methodical man, not sensationalist, and he understood that the absence of an explanation is not the same as the presence of a mystery. But the discrepancy he identified has never been fully resolved. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to replicate ancient drill marks using reconstructed tools, copper tube drills fed with sand, abrasive weighted bow drills, various configurations of manual and semi-mechanical apparatus. The results approximate the ancient work. They produce holes in hard stone. They leave spiral grooves, but they do not quite match the originals in consistency, depth, uniformity, or penetration rate. A gap persists between what modern replication achieves and what the ancient craftsmen left behind. In Mesopotamia, the same gap appears. The diorite vessels from Sumerian sites exhibit machining characteristics, a word researchers use reluctantly because it implies mechanical process that copper and bronze tools should not produce. The interior surfaces of some bowls are polished to a near mirror finish with polishing marks running in directions consistent with rotational movement. The rims are level. The wall thickness is uniform, sometimes varying by less than a millimeter across the entire circumference. To achieve this by hand shaping the interior and exterior simultaneously, while maintaining symmetry, would require not just skill, but a method of measurement and verification during the carving process. You would need to check your work as you went comparing wall thickness at multiple points, ensuring the curvature remained consistent. This implies instruments, gauges, calipers, reference forms that have not been found in the archaeological record, but whose absence does not prove they never existed. Some scholars propose that the answer lies in abrasives rather than tools. Perhaps the Sumerians used harder mineral powders, emery corundum or crushed quartz fed into the drill interface, allowing softer copper tools to cut harder stone indirectly. This is plausible. Abrasive drilling is well documented in later periods, and the principle is sound. A copper tube spinning against stone does little, but a copper tube spinning in a slurry of hard mineral particles becomes an effective cutting instrument. The abrasive does the work. The copper merely holds it in place. Yet even this explanation struggles with the precision of the results. Abrasive drilling with hand tools tends to produce holes that widen slightly at the top, where the drill wobbles before finding its centre, and narrow toward the bottom where pressure decreases as depth increases. The Sumerian drill holes do not show this pattern. They maintain their diameter. They stay cylindrical. The grooves remain parallel. Whatever method produced them achieved a level of mechanical consistency that hand operation typically does not allow. Perhaps the craftsmen were simply more skilled than modern replicators. Perhaps they spent months on a single vessel correcting imperfections with obsessive care. Perhaps we underestimate what patience and expertise can achieve when applied across generations of specialized labor. These are reasonable responses and they may be correct, but they are also in a sense admissions acknowledgements that we cannot fully explain the process using the tools and techniques we have attributed to the period. The drilling anomaly does not stand alone. It belongs to a constellation of technical achievements. The crystal lens ground to optical precision, the copper and clay assembly that generates voltage, the mathematical system that appeared fully developed, each one individually explicable through some combination of skill, patience, and fortunate accident, but collectively forming a pattern that resists easy dismissal. One anomaly is a curiosity. Two are a coincidence. But when the same characteristic, unexpected sophistication, appearing without clear developmental precedent, surfaces across multiple categories of evidence at multiple sites, the pattern begins to suggest something about the culture that produced it. The Sumerians did not describe themselves as experimenters. Their own texts frame their knowledge differently in language that points not forward toward discovery, but backward toward recovery. And the word they used for the principles underlying their civilization, a word with no clean translation into any modern language, carries implications that shift the entire question from how they achieved what they achieved to where that achievement originally came from. The word that means everything. What do you call something that contains the knowledge of metallurgy, the principle of kingship, the technique of canal building, the art of music, the practice of law, and the secret of how to work copper into vessels that hold what the scribes called the fire of heaven? The Sumerians had a word for it. They called it imi, and it is one of the most difficult terms in all of ancient linguistics, not because it cannot be translated, but because no single translation captures what it held. The emi were not objects, though they could be carried. They were not laws, though they governed behavior. They were not formulas, though they encoded procedures. Scholars have rendered the word variously as divine decrees, cosmic powers, cultural norms, civilizational codes. Each translation captures a facet but misses the whole. The emi functioned in Sumerian thought as something closer to blueprints, comprehensive instructions for every domain of organized life, from the sacred to the technical, from the abstract to the deeply practical. They included the knowledge of how to plant grain, how to brew beer, how to smelt metal, how to observe the stars, how to write, how to build, how to heal. They were, in the Sumerian understanding, the complete operating system of civilization itself. What matters for our purposes is not what the emi contained, but where the Sumerians said they came from. The texts are consistent on this point across centuries of composition. The emi were not invented by humanity. They were not discovered through experimentation or accumulated through generations of trial and error. They were gifts brought down from the divine realm, entrusted to human guardians, and restored after catastrophe. The mythology surrounding the ME describes them as having existed before the current order of the world began, preserved through destruction carried across the break between one age and the next. In the poem known as Inanna and Enki, one of the oldest narrative compositions in human literature, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu to obtain the ME from the god Enki who guards them. Enki, in a state of intoxication, gives them to her, all of them dozens of discrete powers and principles, and Inanna loads them onto her boat and carries them back to her city of Uruk. When Enki sobers and realizes what he has done, he sends creatures to recover them, but Inanna has already secured the ME within Uruk's walls. The story reads on one level as a myth of rivalry between cities, but on another level it describes something remarkably specific, the physical transfer of encoded knowledge from one location to another, carried in a vessel guarded against loss. The language of these texts intersects at unexpected points with the physical artifacts sitting in museum storage. Temple inventory lists from Uruk and other Sumerian cities catalogue ritual and practical objects with careful, bureaucratic precision. Among the expected entries, clay lamps, incense burners, ceremonial blades, appear descriptions that do not map easily onto any known object category. Vessels of shining copper that hold the fire of heaven are distinguished in these lists from ordinary oil lamps. They are noted as containing inner rods of iron and being filled with sharp water, a phrase that appears in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian contexts to describe acidic liquids. The terminology is not poetic generality. It is specific enough to differentiate these objects from other copper vessels, other iron implements, other liquid containers in the same inventory. When you place these textual descriptions beside the physical assembly found at Kujut Rabu, the copper cylinder, the iron rod, the clay vessel designed to hold acidic liquid, the correspondence is difficult to ignore. The texts describe an object. The archaeological record contains an object. The two match in material structure and apparent function. Whether the match is meaningful or coincidental remains debated, but the parallel exists, and it has existed since the tablets were first translated, waiting for someone to hold the text in one hand and the artifact in the other. Similar correspondences surface in other domains. Artisan tool lists mention stones of clarity and stones that bring seeing to darkness, terms associated with the workshops of seal cutters, craftsmen who carved intricate miniature scenes into cylinder seals no larger than a thumb. The work required extraordinary visual precision. Modern scholars have often wondered how ancient engravers achieved such fine detail without magnification. The inventory descriptions suggest they may not have worked unaided. If the stones of clarity refer to ground crystal lenses, objects like the Nimruda lens capable of 3 times magnification, then the tool lists are not speaking in metaphor. They are recording equipment. Medical tablets extend the pattern further. Sumerian and Akkadian physicians documented compound recipes with a specificity that reads less like folk tradition and more like procedural chemistry. One well-known text instructs the practitioner to mix the copper salts with the juice of sour grapes until the liquid turns green, then apply the resulting compound with a bronze implement, specifically not iron. The distinction matters. Copper salts react differently with iron than with bronze in acidic solution. Using an iron applicator could contaminate the preparation, or produce an unintended chemical reaction. Whoever wrote that instruction understood material interaction at a level that implies tested, repeated observation, not guesswork, but protocol. Another text describes mixtures that harden like metal, but are not metal, possibly referencing early cements or bitumen-based composites. The instructions specify heating temperatures, cooling durations, and ingredient ratios. The language of recipe, yes, but also the language of engineering, where precision determines whether the product succeeds or fails. These are not myths dressed in technical language. They are technical documents preserved in a culture that treated such knowledge as sacred inheritance. And here the ME return. Because the Sumerians did not frame this knowledge as the product of human cleverness. They framed it as restoration, the recovery of something that had existed before, something that had survived a great destruction. The Eridu Genesis, among the oldest Sumerian cosmological texts, describes the establishment of cities' agriculture and organized human life not as a first creation but as a rebuilding. The world before had been destroyed by flood. The gods preserved certain humans, and crucially certain knowledge. The ME were carried through the catastrophe and reinstated on the other side. This framing could be purely mythological, a culture's way of lending divine authority to its own institutions. Many scholars read it exactly that way, and the reading is reasonable. Cultures throughout history have attributed their achievements to divine origin as a means of legitimation. But the framing also carries a structural implication that is harder to set aside. If the Sumerians understood their knowledge as recovered rather than originated, then their relationship to that knowledge was one of preservation, not exploration. They were not pushing forward into the unknown. They were maintaining what had been handed to them, copying it faithfully, transmitting it through institutions designed to prevent loss. The scribal schools, the Edebus, functioned precisely this way. Young scribes spent years learning to reproduce cuneiform texts with exacting accuracy. The curriculum was not creative. It was conservative, focused on perfect replication of existing documents. Mathematical procedures were memorized and copied. Astronomical observations were recorded in formats that had remained unchanged for centuries. Medical recipes were transmitted word for word, generation after generation. The system was not designed to generate new knowledge. It was designed to keep old knowledge from disappearing. Whether that old knowledge was truly old, whether it genuinely predated Sumer and survived some earlier disruption, or whether the Sumerians simply mythologized their own achievements, is a question the texts alone cannot answer. But the physical artifacts add a dimension the texts lack. They provide material evidence of applied principles, electrochemistry, optics, precision engineering, that the texts describe and the timeline struggles to accommodate. Together, text and object form a kind of quiet testimony, each corroborating the other without either one proving anything on its own. The ME was said to have been carried across water, preserved through flood, guarded against loss. And in the geological record beneath Mesopotamian soil, there is evidence that such a flood or floods actually occurred. The next trace lies not in copper or crystal or cuneiform, but in 8 feet of sterile clay, 8 feet of silence. In the winter of 1929, Leonard Woolley's excavation team at cut through a layer of artifacts, pottery shards, ash deposits, fragments of mud brick architecture, and entered a stratum that contained nothing at all. Clean uniform clay, no pottery, no charcoal, no building debris, no evidence of human presence. Just river silt, fine-grained and sterile, deposited by water and left undisturbed for millennia. The workers dug through it for 8 feet before human material appeared again. Different pottery styles, earlier construction techniques, a settlement that had been living and functioning before something buried it completely beneath meters of waterborne sediment. Woolley stood at the bottom of his trench and understood what he was looking at. This was not gradual accumulation. This was catastrophic deposition, the signature of a flood large enough to submerge an entire city under a blanket of silt so thick that nothing lived in it. Nothing grew through it. Nothing disturbed it until his workers' spades broke through from above. He calculated the volume of water required to deposit 8 feet of sediment across the footprint of ancient Ur and arrived at a figure that exceeded any normal seasonal flooding of the Euphrates. This was not a river overflowing its banks during spring melt. This was inundation on a scale that would have erased settlements, drowned agricultural land, and displaced or killed entire populations across the southern Mesopotamian plain. The discovery might have remained a local curiosity, one site, one flood layer, one dramatic but geographically limited event, except that it wasn't local. Excavations at other Mesopotamian sites revealed comparable deposits. At Kish, roughly 200 kilometers northwest of Ur, archaeologists found a similar sterile layer separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. At Shuruppak, the very city that Sumerian tradition names as the home of the flood hero Ziusudra, flood deposits appeared in the expected stratigraphic position. At Uruk, at Lagash, at sites scattered across the alluvial plain, the same signature repeated a layer of clean silt, dividing the world into before and after. The dates did not align perfectly. The flood layer at Ur was dated to approximately 3500 BC by some researchers, while deposits at Kish and Shuruppak clustered closer to 2900 BC. This discrepancy suggests either multiple flooding events spread across centuries, or a single prolonged period of hydrological instability, during which catastrophic inundations struck different areas at different times. Geologists have proposed several mechanisms: tectonic shifts altering river courses, massive storm surges from the Persian Gulf, rapid glacial meltwater pulses channeled through the Tigris-Euphrates system. The cause remains debated. The effect does not. Something drowned the cities of southern Mesopotamia, and it happened within the time frame that Sumerian literary tradition assigns to the Great Flood. That tradition is remarkably specific. The Sumerian King List, a document that traces royal succession from the earliest times, records kings and dynasties in two distinct phases before the flood and after it. The antediluvian kings ruled from 5 cities: Eridu, Bad, Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, and their reign lengths are measured in spans of tens of thousands of years. Then comes a single line, stark in its brevity: the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descends again, but the reign lengths contract dramatically from cosmic spans to human-scale generations. Whatever the numbers represent literal years, symbolic periods, astronomical cycles, the structure of the list encodes a memory of discontinuity. A world existed. It was interrupted. A new world began. The flood narrative itself survives in multiple versions. In the Sumerian account, Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki to build a vessel and preserve life through the coming destruction. In the later Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, the figure becomes Utnapishtim, who receives similar instructions: seal the boat with bitumen, load it with animals, and craftsmen bring aboard the seed of all living things. The parallels with the biblical Noah are well documented and widely discussed, but what often receives less attention is a detail common to the Mesopotamian versions that the biblical account omits. The survivors do not merely preserve biological life, they preserve knowledge. Craftsmen are specifically brought aboard people with technical skills, the ability to rebuild. The ME, those divine blueprints of civilization, are said to be carried through the catastrophe and restored on the other side. This is not a story about survival alone. It is a story about transmission, the deliberate effort to carry knowledge across a break in continuity. And when the archaeological record shows sophisticated civilization appearing in the southern Mesopotamia, shortly after the flood deposits cities, writing mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, arriving with a completeness that has puzzled scholars for over a century, the mythological framing and the material evidence begin to press against each other in ways that neither fully explains. The flood layers are real. The discontinuity in the archaeological record is real. The Sumerian self-description as restorers rather than inventors is documented across hundreds of texts. Whether these 3 facts connect in the way the ancient narratives suggest, whether knowledge truly survived a catastrophe and was rebuilt on the other side, or whether the correspondence is coincidental, a culture mythologizing its own rapid development is precisely the kind of question that responsible scholarship finds difficult to answer, and even more difficult to ignore. And it is exactly here at the point where evidence and interpretation press hardest against each other that the strongest objections arise. Because not everyone who examines these artifacts and texts sees a mystery. Some see only the ordinary workings of time, chance, and human ingenuity, and their arguments deserve the same careful attention we have given to the anomalies themselves. The ordinary explanation: not every object that puzzles us is a mystery. Some are simply misunderstood familiar things seen from an unfamiliar angle. Their strangeness a product of our expectations rather than their nature. The copper and clay vessel from Kujut Rabu may be one of these. The Nimrud lens may be another. And the scholars who argue for ordinary explanations are not being dismissive. They are being careful in the way that science requires, when the alternative is to rewrite a timeline supported by decades of accumulated evidence. The most straightforward objection to the Baghdad battery hypothesis is provenance. The artifact was found in a Parthian period layer roughly 250 BC, not in a Sumerian context. The Parthians were heirs to Hellenistic culture influenced by Greek science, which by that period had begun developing its own understanding of natural philosophy and material interaction. A Parthian-era object that produces electrochemical effects does not necessarily imply Sumerian knowledge of electricity. It may imply nothing more than Parthian experimentation, possibly influenced by Greek thought, producing a device whose function was observed empirically without being theoretically understood. The leap from a Parthian vessel to a Sumerian scientific tradition requires intermediate evidence objects of similar design from intervening centuries' textual descriptions that can be unambiguously linked to electrochemical processes, and that intermediate evidence, while suggestive, is not conclusive. The cuneiform descriptions of vessels of shining copper that hold the fire of heaven are evocative, but translation is an imperfect art, particularly when dealing with languages dead for millennia. Sharp water might refer to any number of acidic or astringent liquids used in cleaning, dyeing, or ritual purification. The fire of heaven could describe the gleam of polished copper in lamplight, the warmth of a vessel filled with heated liquid, or a purely metaphorical attribute assigned to objects of sacred significance. Cuneiform scholars caution against reading ancient inventory lists through the lens of modern technology. The temptation to see batteries and lenses in Sumerian texts may say more about our own technological assumptions than about ancient Mesopotamian practices. The Nimrud lens faces a similar critique. Rock crystal was valued throughout the ancient world for its clarity and beauty. It was carved into beads, inlays, and decorative objects across multiple cultures and periods. The fact that a particular piece of polished crystal happens to focus light does not prove it was designed to focus light. Curvature can emerge from the polishing process itself, the natural result of rubbing a convex surface against a flat abrasive, gradually wearing the centre more than the edges. The optical properties may be incidental, a byproduct of craftsmanship rather than its purpose. Archaeologists who favour this interpretation point out that no ancient Mesopotamian text unambiguously describes the use of lenses for magnification in the way that, say, medieval European texts describe spectacles. The stones of clarity in artisan tool lists might refer to any transparent or translucent material used to examine surfaces under good light, not necessarily a shaped optical instrument. The precision drilling presents a more technical challenge, but here too conventional explanations have force. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that copper tube drills, when used with hard abrasive powders such as crushed quartz or emery, can cut into diorite and granite. The process is slow, far slower than modern methods, but it works. The consistency of the ancient drill holes may reflect not unknown technology, but extraordinary specialization craftsmen who spent entire careers perfecting a single technique, working within guild traditions that passed refined methods from master to apprentice across generations. We tend to underestimate what sustained human attention can achieve. A modern researcher, attempting to replicate ancient drilling in a laboratory over weeks, may not match the results of an ancient specialist who refined the same process over a lifetime. The gap between experimental replication and ancient achievement may be a gap of practice, not of principle. And the broader pattern, the apparent suddenness of Sumerian civilization, the mathematical sophistication, the linguistic isolation admits more measured explanations as well. Archaeological visibility is not the same as historical reality. The flood layers that Woolley discovered did not merely mark a catastrophe, they destroyed evidence. Settlements that existed before the floods were buried, dissolved, scattered. The developmental stages that preceded Sumerian urban civilization may simply have been erased from the record by the very events that the Sumerians later mythologized. What looks like sudden appearance may be an artifact of preservation, not the absence of gradual development, but the absence of evidence for gradual development, which is a very different thing. The base 60 mathematical system, while sophisticated, is not inexplicable. Cultures develop number systems suited to their practical needs. A trading society handling frequent division of goods benefits from a base with many divisors. The choice of 60 may reflect pragmatic refinement over centuries of commercial activity, centuries that preceded the earliest written records and therefore left no documentary trace. The system appears complete in the first tablets, because the first tablets post-date its development, not because the development did not occur. These are reasonable positions. They do not require conspiracies or cover-ups. They ask only that we apply the same evidentiary standards to extraordinary claims that we apply to ordinary ones, and by those standards the case for lost pre-Sumerian technology remains unproven. The artifacts are real, their properties are measurable, but the interpretation of those properties as evidence of inherited scientific knowledge involves inferences that the physical evidence alone does not compel. And yet, the objections account for individual anomalies but struggle with the accumulation. One incidental lens is unremarkable. One accidental battery is a curiosity. One unexplained drilling technique is a gap in the experimental record. But when the same characteristic precision exceeding expectation appearing without visible developmental precedent surfaces in optics, electrochemistry, stone, machining, mathematics, and astronomical observation, all within the same cultural complex, the coincidence begins to feel less comfortable. It may still be coincidence. It may be the natural result of a sophisticated culture whose earlier stages were simply lost to flood and time. The discomfort is that we cannot be certain either way, and certainty is what the conventional timeline was built to provide. The pattern does not prove inheritance, but it does something almost as unsettling. It makes inheritance plausible, and plausibility once admitted has a way of spreading. Because Mesopotamia is not the only place where sophisticated knowledge appears earlier than expected, and the Sumerians are not the only ancient people who claimed their civilization was a restoration rather than a creation. The same whisper surfaces thousands of miles away in stone circles older than Sumer by 6,000 years. The hilltop before everything. In September 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt climbed a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, about 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa. The hill was called Göbekli Tepe Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and it had been surveyed once before in the 1960s by a joint team from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul. That earlier survey had noted some worked flint fragments on the surface, and a few unusual stone slabs protruding from the soil, but the team had classified the site as a medieval cemetery and moved on. Schmidt, who had spent years studying Neolithic sites across the region, looked at the same stone slabs and saw something different. The shapes were too regular for grave markers. The surfaces were too carefully dressed. He arranged for a small excavation the following year, and what emerged from the hilltop redrew the boundaries of what we thought early humans could build. The first pillars appeared just below the surface, massive T-shaped columns of limestone, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing between 10 and 20 tons. They were arranged in rough circles, their flat faces oriented inward, their surfaces carved with elaborate relief sculptures of animals: lions, foxes, boars, cranes, scorpions, snakes, rendered not in crude outline but with anatomical detail and deliberate composition. Some pillars bore abstract symbols arranged in patterns that suggested intentional grouping, though their meaning remains undeciphered. Between the pillars, low stone walls formed enclosures that appeared to serve no domestic purpose. There were no hearths, no storage pits, no residences. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was built for, it was not a place where people lived. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest construction layers at approximately 9,500 BC, more than 6,000 years before the first Sumerian cities, more than 5,000 years before the first known pottery in the region, and roughly 4,000 years before the invention of the wheel. The people who quarried, transported, shaped, and erected these pillars were according to the conventional framework pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers. They had no metal tools, they had no draft animals, they had no permanent settlements, at least none that have been found in direct association with the site. And yet they organised a labour force capable of moving 20-ton blocks of limestone from quarries several hundred metres away, carved those blocks with a sophistication that implies specialised artisans, and arranged them according to a plan that required geometric understanding and coordinated effort, sustained over what may have been decades or centuries of construction. The scale alone is striking, but the precision is what lingers. The pillars are not rough monoliths dragged into approximate position. They are shaped to consistent proportions, the T-form repeated across multiple enclosures with variations that suggest a shared template adapted to individual expression rather than independent invention at each pillar. The carved reliefs show depth control with animals emerging from the stone surface at carefully modulated levels. Some carvings interlock with the architecture, wrapping around pillar edges in ways that require the sculptor to understand the three-dimensional geometry of the column before beginning to cut. This is not the work of people experimenting with stone for the first time. It is the work of a tradition, a body of knowledge about materials, tools and techniques that had already been refined before the first pillar at Göbekli Tepe was raised. And then around 8000 BC the builders stopped. Not gradually, not through decline or abandonment, but deliberately. The enclosures were carefully filled with rubble, thousands of tons of stone bone and sediment packed into the circular chambers until the pillars were buried to their tops. The site was sealed intentionally and thoroughly as though its creators wanted to preserve it beneath the earth rather than leave it exposed to whatever came next. No one has satisfactorily explained why. The burial was too systematic to be accidental, too labour-intensive to be casual. Someone decided that Göbekli Tepe's time was over and took extraordinary steps to close it. After Göbekli Tepe, the archaeological record in the region shows what appears by comparison to be regression. The monumental construction ceases. The sites that follow Nevele, Chori Chayonu, other early Neolithic settlements in the same area, are smaller, simpler, more clearly domestic in function. The leap in organisational capacity and artistic sophistication that Göbekli Tepe represents does not continue in a straight upward line. It peaks early, and then recedes like a wave that reaches further up the shore than anything that follows it for thousands of years. This pattern's sudden sophistication, followed by apparent decline, mirrors at a much earlier date the pattern that makes Sumer so puzzling. A culture appears possessing capabilities that seem to exceed its context. The capabilities do not build gradually from simpler precedents. They arrive, they flourish, and then they diminish or disappear, leaving behind physical evidence that subsequent cultures cannot easily replicate. At Göbekli Tepe, the evidence is in stone. In Sumer, it is in stone and copper and crystal and cuneiform. The materials differ. The chronological distance is vast, more than 6 millennia separate the burial of Göbekli Tepe from the emergence of Sumerian urban civilization. No direct chain of transmission has been established between the two, but the structural similarity is difficult to dismiss entirely. Both cultures demonstrated knowledge that appeared in context premature. Both left artifacts whose precision challenges the tool inventory assigned to their period. Both existed at moments when the conventional narrative expects simplicity, and instead finds complexity. And both in their own ways resist the assumption that human technological development follows a single unbroken upward curve. Göbekli Tepe does not explain Sumer. It does not prove that a lost civilization transmitted knowledge across millennia. What it does is widen the field of possibility. It demonstrates that organized, sophisticated, large-scale construction, requiring planning geometry, specialized labor, and sustained collective effort, existed far earlier than the conventional timeline predicted. If such capability existed at 9500 BC, then the question of what else might have existed in the long millennia between Göbekli Tepe and Sumer becomes harder to wave away. 6,000 years is an enormous span, longer than the entire period from Sumer to the present day. A great deal can be built and lost and forgotten in 6,000 years. The hilltop in southeastern Turkey is quiet now. The excavations continue under successive archaeological teams, slowly uncovering enclosures that have waited beneath the soil for more than 11,000 years. Each new pillar that emerges carries the same message as the ones before it, that the people who built this place knew more than we expected, organized more than we assumed, and then for reasons we do not understand chose to bury what they had made. Sumer would not rise for another 60 centuries, but when it did, it too would carry knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than its own beginnings, and it too would describe that knowledge not as invention, but as something recovered from a world that came before. The language that came from nowhere. One detail about Sumerian has troubled linguists since the first cuneiform tablets were deciphered. In the 19th century, it has no relatives. Every other major language of the ancient Near East belongs to a family. Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian. These are Semitic languages, cousins of Hebrew and Arabic, traceable along a branching tree of shared roots and grammatical structures. The Indo-European family connects Greek and Sanskrit, Latin and Old Persian across thousands of miles of geography and centuries of divergence. Even languages that seem isolated often reveal under careful analysis distant connections to larger groups. Sumerian reveals nothing. It stands alone in the linguistic record, an isolate connected to no known family, ancient or modern, anywhere in the world. This is not for lack of trying. Over the past century and a half, scholars have proposed links between Sumerian and Dravidian languages of southern India, Kartvelian languages of the Caucasus, Uralic languages of northern Eurasia, and even distant families in Central Asia. None of these proposals has gained consensus. The resemblances are too few, too superficial, or too easily explained by coincidence to establish genetic relationship. Sumerian remains what it has been since its disferment, a language without ancestry, appearing in the written record around 3200 BC, already equipped with complex grammar-specialized vocabulary and the capacity to express abstract thought with precision. The grammar alone suggests maturity. Sumerian verbs carry chains of prefixes and suffixes that encode tense aspect mood causation, and the relationship between subject-object and indirect object sometimes within a single word. The system allows extraordinary specificity. A scribe could distinguish in a few syllables between an action completed in the past, an action intended for the future, an action caused by one agent upon another, and an action performed on behalf of a third party. This is not the tentative grammar of a language finding its structure. It is the refined product of the long development that by definition must have occurred before the earlier surviving texts. Where that development took place is unknown. The absence of linguistic ancestors means the absence of a traceable homeland. Most language families can be mapped backward to an approximate region of origin based on shared vocabulary for local flora, fauna, and geography. Sumerian offers no such clues. Its core vocabulary includes terms for reed marshes, date palms, and river agriculture, consistent with southern Mesopotamia, but these could be adoptions from the environment, rather than inheritances from the language's deeper past. The words a language uses for its surroundings tell you where it lives, not necessarily where it was born. What Sumerian did carry embedded in its vocabulary and its usage was technical knowledge of remarkable range. The language contained specialized terms for architectural elements, specific types of walls, foundations, drainage channels, roofing techniques that presuppose not just building activity, but a taxonomy of building activity, a system for classifying and communicating construction methods. It had distinct words for different stages of metal, smelting different qualities of finished metal, different types of casting and hammering. It distinguished between varieties of stone categories of soil grades of wool and grain with a precision that suggests centuries of accumulated classification. And then there is the mathematics. The sexagesimal system base 60 appears in the earliest Sumerian administrative records, already functioning as a mature computational framework. Scribes used it to calculate areas, volumes, weights, and astronomical intervals. They divided the circle into 360 degrees the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, conventions that have survived without interruption for 5,000 years. We still measure time and angles using a number system invented or inherited by people whose language we cannot trace to any origin. The choice of 60 as a base is itself revealing. 60 is the smallest number divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It accommodates halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, and sixths, without producing the awkward repeating fractions that plague base 10 arithmetic. 1/3 of 60 is 20 clean whole simple. 1/3 of 10 is 3.333, repeating endlessly. For a civilization engaged in dividing land, distributing grain, apportioning labour, and tracking celestial cycles, base 60 offers practical advantages that base 10 does not. But recognizing those advantages requires mathematical abstraction, an understanding of divisibility properties, and their computational implications that goes beyond simple counting. Someone at some point evaluated the properties of different number bases and selected 60 for its superior utility. That is not intuition. That is analysis. The conventional explanation is that the system evolved organically from earlier counting practices, perhaps a merger of base 5 finger counting with base 12 knuckle counting, producing 60 as a convenient synthesis. This is plausible, and it may be correct, but it accounts for the origin of 60 as a number, without fully accounting for the sophistication of the system built upon it. Sumerian mathematical tablets demonstrate operations, quadratic equations, geometric progressions, calculations of square and cube roots that belong to a developed mathematical tradition, not a nascent one. Old Babylonian scribal exercises dating to roughly 1800 BC, but copying from much older Sumerian sources include problems that apply what we call the Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras received credit for its discovery. The tablet known as Plimpton 322, now at Columbia University, contains a table of Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 whole numbers, that satisfy the equation arranged in a sequence that implies systematic generation, not random collection. This mathematical inheritance was carried like everything else in the Sumerian language. Even after Sumerian ceased to be spoken, probably by the early 2nd millennium BC, it persisted as a scholarly language in scribal schools across Mesopotamia. Young Babylonian and Assyrian scribes learned to read and write Sumerian the way medieval European scholars learned Latin as the language of authority tradition, and preserved knowledge. Technical texts, mathematical procedures, astronomical tables, medical recipes, chemical instructions continued to be copied in Sumerian for centuries after the language had died as a vehicle of daily communication. The language became a container carrying knowledge that might otherwise have fragmented or disappeared as political regimes rose and fell, and spoken languages shifted around it. A language with no known origin, carrying a mathematical system of unexplained sophistication preserved by institutional effort across millennia of cultural change. Each element taken alone admits a conventional explanation. Together they form something harder to name, not proof of inheritance from some lost antecedent, but a shape in the evidence that looks like inheritance, that behaves like inheritance, that the Sumerians themselves described as inheritance. Whether we choose to see it that way depends on how much weight we give to absence, the absence of linguistic relatives, the absence of mathematical precursors, the absence of a developmental trail leading from simple to complex. These absences may reflect only the limits of preservation, or they may reflect the limits of our willingness to consider that the trail begins somewhere we have not yet looked. The language carried the knowledge. The scribal schools transmitted it. But transmission requires purpose, a reason to preserve a fear of loss. And the Sumerians had a reason. They had seen or believed they had seen what happens when knowledge vanishes. Their own traditions told them so, and the cultures that rose alongside them, separated by thousands of miles, but connected by the same strange pattern of sudden sophistication, seemed to carry the same quiet insistence that what they knew was not. The same pattern, 1,000 miles away. Along the banks of the Indus River and its tributaries across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a civilization rose in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC that shared almost nothing with Sumer in language, religion, or artistic style, and yet shared something perhaps more fundamental. It appeared in the archaeological record already complete. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, first excavated in the 1920s, revealed urban planning of a precision that startled the British and Indian archaeologists who uncovered them. Streets laid out on grid patterns, standardized brick sizes, a ratio of 1:4 length to width to height, maintained across settlements separated by hundreds of miles, drainage systems running beneath the streets channeling wastewater from individual homes into covered municipal sewers with inspection points at regular intervals. A great bath at Mohenjo-Daro, waterproofed with bitumen fed by a well and drained by a corbelled outlet, engineering that would not be matched in Europe for 2,000 years. The uniformity is what unsettles. In most ancient civilizations, you can trace regional variation, local pottery styles, idiosyncratic building methods, the organic diversity that results from communities developing independently and gradually converging through trade and contact. The Indus Valley civilization shows remarkably little of this variation. Its weights follow a standardized system, based on multiples of a unit that appears identical across sites, from the Arabian Sea coast to the foothills of the Himalayas. Its script, still undeciphered, appears on seals and tablets, with consistent sign forms across the entire geographic range. The bricks are the same, the street widths are the same. The drainage engineering follows the same principles applied with the same precision, whether the city sits on a river plain or a coastal delta. This degree of standardization implies centralized planning, institutional authority, and crucially a body of technical knowledge that was codified, transmitted and enforced across an area larger than ancient Egypt. And yet the Indus Valley civilization has left no decipherable texts explaining how this was accomplished. No king lists, no monumental inscriptions, no literary tradition that survives in readable form. The script remains locked, its language unknown, its contents a matter of speculation. What we have are the cities themselves, and the cities speak in their own mute way of knowledge that arrived organised. Like Sumer, the Indus Valley civilization appears in the archaeological record without a proportionate developmental prelude. Earlier settlements exist. Mehrgar in the foothills of Balochistan shows continuous occupation from roughly 7000 BC, with gradual development of agriculture, pottery and craft production. But the jump from Mehrgar's village-scale organisation to the urban sophistication of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro is steep. The intervening stages, if they existed in full, have not been clearly documented. The cities seem to arrive with their planning already in place, their standards already set, their engineering already proven. The same unsettling pattern in a different material vocabulary surfaces in Egypt. The Old Kingdom, beginning around 2686 BC, produced monumental architecture that represents one of the most dramatic leaps in construction history. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, traditionally considered the first large-scale stone building in the world, was followed within a few generations by the Great Pyramid at Giza, whose construction involved the precise placement of roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each, with exterior casing stones fitted so tightly that a razor blade cannot be inserted between them. The interior chambers exhibit granite work of extraordinary precision. Flinders Petrie, that meticulous measurer, found the granite sarcophagus in the king's chamber to be flat to within 1/1000th of an inch, a tolerance that modern machinists would consider respectable. The conventional timeline accommodates this by pointing to the organizational capacity of the Egyptian state, the availability of a large labor force, and the cumulative refinement of construction techniques across the generations between Djoser and Khufu. These are valid factors, but they explain the scale of the achievement more convincingly than they explain its precision. Scale requires labor and logistics. Precision requires knowledge of geometry, of material properties, of measurement techniques accurate enough to maintain tolerances across structures hundreds of meters long. Where that knowledge came from, how it was developed, and why it appeared so rapidly in the archaeological record are questions that remain open. The Egyptians, like the Sumerians, attributed their foundational knowledge to divine sources. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, mathematics and wisdom, was credited with inventing hieroglyphic script, the calendar, and the principles of architecture and medicine. The Vedic tradition of India described 7 sages, the Saptarshi, who preserved knowledge through a great deluge and re-established civilization on the other side. The Greek mythological tradition, later but drawing on older sources, told of Prometheus bringing fire and technical arts to humanity, and of Athena teaching weaving and craft. These are different cultures separated by geography and language, telling variations of the same structural story. Knowledge came from elsewhere, from an earlier time or a higher source, and was given to humanity rather than generated by it. Myth is not evidence. Cultural parallels are not proof of shared origin. The human tendency to attribute foundational knowledge to divine or heroic figures may be a universal psychological pattern, rather than a universal historical memory. These are the cautions that responsible scholarship applies, and they are well-founded. But beneath the caution lies the same quiet discomfort that surfaces whenever the pattern is examined closely. The Sumerians say their knowledge was restored. The Egyptians say theirs was given by Thoth. The Indus Valley cities appear planned from the start. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates monumental capability 6,000 years before any of them. Each case taken alone admits ordinary explanation. Together they form a shape, not a proof, not an argument, but a shape that suggests the story of human civilization may have chapters we have not yet learned to read. And if those chapters exist, then the objects that survive from them, the copper cylinders, the crystal lenses, the precision-drilled stone, are not anomalies at all. They are pages, the schools that refuse to forget. How long does it take to copy a single cuneiform tablet? A trained scribe working with a reed stylus on fresh clay could reproduce a standard administrative document, a grain receipt, a labour roster, a legal contract in perhaps an hour. But the texts preserved in Mesopotamian scribal schools were not standard documents. They were technical compositions dense with specialized vocabulary, mathematical notation, and procedural instructions that had to be reproduced exactly, sign by sign, line by line, without alteration or personal interpretation. A student copying an astronomical table or a medical recipe might spend an entire day on a single tablet, checking each entry against the master copy, correcting errors, by smoothing the clay and rewriting, repeating the process until the reproduction was indistinguishable from the original. This was not education as we understand it. It was ritual preservation, the deliberate painstaking replication of knowledge considered too important to risk losing. The Sumerian scribal schools, the Adabas, literally tablet houses, operated from at least the middle of the 3rd millennium BC and continued in evolved forms through the Babylonian and Assyrian periods. Young students entered as children and spent years in training that was by all surviving accounts rigorous and repetitive. They learned to form cuneiform signs by copying lists, word lists, sign lists, thematic vocabularies, organized by subject. They progressed to mathematical exercises, then to literary texts, then to the specialized technical documents that represented the highest level of scribal competence. The curriculum was conservative by design. Innovation was not the goal, accuracy was. What the schools preserved was not merely language, but the knowledge encoded in that language. Mathematical procedures for calculating the area of irregular fields, astronomical tables tracking the movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn across multi-year cycles, medical texts specifying compound preparations with precise measurements, which minerals to grind, which liquids to mix, how long to heat, how long to cool, architectural ratios for temple construction, metallurgical instructions distinguishing between grades of copper, specifying flux compositions for different types of smelting. These were not theoretical treatises. They were operational documents, instructions meant to be followed by practitioners who would use them to build, to heal, to calculate, to craft. The transmission chain is documented across centuries. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1800 BC, contain colophons, scribal notations, indicating that the text was copied from an ancient original or written according to the old tablets. Some specify the source tablet's location, the name of the institution that held it, even the condition of the original. These are the marks of a culture that understood its texts as links in a chain, stretching backward in time, each copy connecting the present to a source that was already old when the copyist was born. The scribes did not claim authorship, they claimed fidelity. Even after Sumerian ceased to be anyone's mother tongue, probably by the early 2nd millennium BC, the schools continued teaching it. Babylonian students learned Sumerian the way students in a later age would learn Latin or classical Chinese as a language of scholarship, religion, and technical authority. Bilingual dictionaries were compiled, grammatical analyses were written. The dead language was maintained as a living medium for knowledge that the culture considered foundational, not because Sumerian was inherently superior to Akkadian, but because the knowledge it carried had been received in Sumerian, and the tradition demanded it be transmitted in the same form. This system of preservation could in principle carry information across catastrophic breaks. If a flood destroyed a city, but a few scribes escaped with tablets, or with memorized texts since advanced students were trained to recite compositions, from memory the knowledge could be re-established in a new location. The physical infrastructure might be lost. The clay tablets might dissolve in floodwater, but the trained minds that held the content could recreate it sign by sign on fresh clay in a new school. The chain would be stretched, perhaps thinned, but not necessarily broken. History offers parallels. After the fall of Rome, European monasteries preserved classical texts through centuries of political collapse and cultural disruption. Monks who may not have fully understood the Greek philosophy or Roman engineering they were copying nonetheless reproduced the text with sufficient accuracy that the knowledge survived to be rediscovered and applied centuries later. The copying was mechanical, sometimes imperfect, but it worked. Knowledge crossed the gap between one civilization and the next, carried by institutions whose purpose was preservation rather than innovation. The Mesopotamian scribal schools were far older and arguably more systematic than medieval European monasteries. They operated within cultures that explicitly valued the maintenance of ancient knowledge that framed their own achievements as continuations of an earlier tradition, and that invested significant institutional resources in ensuring that technical documents were copied, stored, and transmitted without loss. If any ancient institution was capable of preserving sophisticated knowledge across a catastrophic discontinuity, a flood, a collapse, a centuries-long, dark period, it was this one. The question is not whether the mechanism existed. It did. The scribal schools are documented. Their methods are known. Their products survive by the tens of thousands. The question is whether the knowledge they preserved was genuinely older than Sumer, whether the ancient originals from which Babylonian scribes copied were themselves copies of still earlier texts stretching back to a source that predated the flood layers in the archaeological record. The scribes believed so. Their colophons say so. But colophons are claims, not proofs, and the physical tablets that might confirm the chain's earliest links have not survived, dissolved perhaps in the same floodwaters that buried the cities of the antediluvian world. What has survived are the artifacts, the copper cylinders, the crystal lenses, the precision-drilled stone objects that embody the kind of applied knowledge the scribal schools were designed to preserve. They do not carry colophons, they do not name their sources, but they speak in their own material language of procedures, followed carefully designs, repeated consistently principles, understood well enough to produce functional results. Each one is a tablet of a different kind, not inscribed in cuneiform but in copper and crystal, carrying instructions written in the grammar of physics and chemistry, rather than the grammar of Sumerian. Whether those instructions were first composed in the scribal schools of Ur and Uruk, or whether they arrived there already, ancient carried across a break, we can only partially see as the question that the artifacts pose but cannot answer alone. For that we must return to the objects themselves not as curiosities or anomalies, but as evidence, and ask what the most careful modern analysis reveals about how they were made and what they were made to do. What the replicas revealed. Between 0.8 and 2 volts. That is the range measured, recorded, and replicated that a clay jar filled with vinegar will produce when it contains a copper cylinder and a suspended iron rod arranged in the configuration found at Chujut Rabu. The number is small. It would not light a modern bulb or power a device of any complexity. But it is not zero. It is consistent, reproducible, and it persists as long as the electrolyte remains chemically active, and it emerges not from sophisticated modern materials, but from components that any Mesopotamian craftsman could have assembled with tools available in the 3rd century BC, or for that matter, the 3rd millennium BC. The definitive reconstruction experiments took place at the British Science Museum in 1978. Researchers fabricated replicas using period-appropriate methods, copper sheet rolled and soldered, by hand-iron rods forged from bloom iron with slag inclusions typical of ancient reduction furnaces, clay vessels fired at temperatures consistent with Mesopotamian pottery traditions, and natural bitumen for the asphalt seal. No modern shortcuts, no industrial purity metals. The assembly followed the ancient configuration, exactly copper cylinder, fitted inside the clay jar iron rod, suspended centrally through the asphalt plug gap, maintained between the two metals so they would not make direct contact. They tested multiple electrolytes. Vinegar acetic acid produced voltage in the range of 0.8 to 1.1 volts. Fermented grape juice performed similarly. Copper sulfate solution, which could have been produced by dissolving copper minerals in acidic liquid, pushed the output close to 2 volts. The current was measured in milliamps, weak by any modern standard, but sufficient researchers noted for at least one practical application: electroplating. A thin film of gold can be deposited onto a silver surface using remarkably little electrical current, provided the current is sustained over time. Mesopotamian metalworkers produced gilded objects. The technique by which they achieved that gilding has never been conclusively identified. Fire gilding with mercury amalgam was one known method, but not all gilded artifacts from the region show the characteristic mercury residues. Electroplating would leave no such residue. It would leave only a thin, even layer of gold bonded to the surface, which is precisely what some of those artifacts exhibit. In 2002, students at Smith College in Massachusetts replicated the experiments and extended them. They connected multiple vessels in series. The positive terminal of one cell linked to the negative terminal of the next, and demonstrated that the combined voltage could indeed drive electroplating of small objects. The gold layer produced was thin, but visible, adherent, and uniform. The experiment did not prove that ancient Mesopotamians electroplated metal. It proved that the tools found in their archaeological record could have been used to do so. The crystal lenses underwent parallel scrutiny. The Nimrud lens, tested with modern interferometric equipment, showed a surface curvature that deviated from an ideal spherical arc by less than 0.5 millimeter, a degree of precision that hand grinding can achieve but that random polishing cannot. The focal length of approximately 11 centimeters and the 3 times magnification capacity were confirmed repeatedly. Researchers noted that achieving such consistency requires not only careful abrasion with fine powders, but also a method of testing optical performance during the grinding process. You must be able to check whether the lens focuses light at the desired distance, adjust your grinding accordingly, and verify the result. This implies iterative refinement guided by understanding, not the theoretical understanding of a modern optician perhaps, but a practical grasp of the relationship between surface shape and optical effect that goes beyond accidental discovery. The material analysis of the original artifacts added another layer. Spectroscopic examination of the Baghdad battery's copper cylinder revealed metal of roughly 98% purity, with trace amounts of arsenic and tin consistent with regional smelting practices, nothing exotic. The iron rod showed bloom iron composition with slag inclusions typical of ancient forging. The ceramic vessel matched known Parthian and earlier Mesopotamian pottery in both clay composition and firing temperature. The asphalt seal was natural bitumen abundant throughout the region. Every individual material belonged to its period. Nothing required importation from distant sources or metallurgical techniques beyond documented ancient capability. What did not belong to conventional expectation was the assembly, the specific way these ordinary materials were combined. The copper cylinder's wall thickness, consistent at roughly 1 millimeter, required careful measurement during fabrication. The iron rod's central suspension, maintained by the asphalt plug with no contact against the copper walls, demanded precise positioning. The proportions of the components, the ratio of cylinder diameter to height, the length of rod relative to interior volume, follow relationships that maximize the surface area of metal exposed to the electrolyte, which in turn maximizes electrical output. These proportions are not random, they are optimized, and optimization implies understanding of the variables being optimized, even if that understanding was practical rather than theoretical. The corrosion evidence reinforced this interpretation. The iron rod's oxidation was concentrated in bands corresponding to a liquid fill level, not distributed uniformly, as it would be from atmospheric exposure during burial. The copper cylinder's interior showed copper acetate deposits heaviest near the bottom, and along the walls consistent with repeated cycles of filling and draining rather than single exposure. Chemical analysis detected acetic acid residues embedded in the corrosion products. The object had been used, not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly and deliberately, with acidic liquid introduced and removed over what may have been an extended period of active service. Conservative scholars rightly point out that function does not prove intent. A vessel that generates voltage when filled with vinegar may have been designed for an entirely different purpose, storage, ritual containment, and its electrochemical properties may have been unknown to its makers. This is possible. But it becomes progressively harder to maintain as each element of the design aligns with electrochemical function. The separation of metals, the fillable interior, the sealed base, the corrosion patterns consistent with acidic use, the proportions that maximize electrical output. At some point, the accumulation of functional alignment crosses a threshold where coincidence requires more faith than intention does. The laboratory evidence does not close the debate, it constrains it. These objects work as devices. Their construction requires planning, precision, and repeatability. Their materials show signs of deliberate sustained use consistent with their technological interpretation. Whether they represent inherited knowledge from an earlier tradition or independent discovery through centuries of empirical craft remains genuinely uncertain. But the uncertainty itself is significant. It means the conventional timeline in which electrochemistry begins with Galvani in the 18th century and optical lenses begin with medieval European glassmakers contains a gap. Something existed in ancient Mesopotamia that those timelines do not account for. Something small, quiet, and functional, sitting in a museum drawer with a label that says Vessel of Unknown Purpose. The laboratory can measure voltage and focal length and corrosion chemistry. What it cannot measure is the weight of all these small things taken together, the pattern they form, when viewed not as isolated curiosities, but as fragments of a single, larger picture. That picture is not complete. It may never be, but its outline has been emerging trace by trace across the chapters of this story, and it asks a question that no single artifact or experiment can answer alone. What the sand still holds. The wind that moves across southern Iraq tonight is the same wind that dried the first cuneiform tablets pressed by Sumerian scribes 5,000 years ago. It carries dust from the ruins of Uruk, where ziggurat foundations still rise from the plain like the exposed bones of something vast and half-remembered. It passes over Tel al-Makaya, where Woolley's excavation trenches cut down through the flood layer that divides the world into before and after. It crosses terrain that was once marshland, once farmland, once the floor of cities whose names survive only in king lists and temple hymns. The landscape has been reworked by millennia of river movement military campaigns, and the slow dissolution of mud brick architecture back into the earth it came from. But beneath the surface, the stratification continues, layer upon layer of human habitation, each one a chapter in a story that extends deeper than any single excavation has yet reached. The artifacts we have followed through this narrative, the copper and clay vessel, the crystal lens, the precision drilled stone, represent only what has been found. They are the fraction of a fraction, the objects that survived flood and decay and the long chemical patience of groundwater working through soil. For every vessel that reached a museum drawer intact, hundreds may have dissolved, corroded, or crumbled beyond recognition in the millennia between their creation and their discovery. For every crystal lens recovered by an excavator's careful hand, others may lie shattered in strata that have not yet been opened, or in sites that have not yet been identified, or beneath modern cities and agricultural fields where excavation is impractical or impossible. This is the fundamental constraint of archaeology. It works with what survives, and survival is not representative. Organic materials, wood textiles, leather papyrus vanish almost entirely in Mesopotamian conditions. Metal corrodes, unbaked clay dissolves. Even fired pottery, the most durable of common ancient materials, reaches us as fragments more often than as whole objects. The record we possess is a remnant shaped as much by the accidents of preservation as by the intentions of the people who created the original objects. What we can say about ancient Mesopotamian technology is limited by what the ground has chosen to give back. What we cannot say may be far larger. The copper cylinder from Kujut Rabu survives because its materials fired. Clay, copper, iron, bitumen resisted the conditions of burial long enough to be recovered. The Nimrud lens survives because rock crystal is essentially indestructible under normal geological conditions. The diorite vessels survive because diorite is one of the hardest common stones on Earth. These objects endured not because they were important, but because they were durable. The fragile things, the written instructions that may have accompanied them, the organic components that may have completed their function, the contextual objects that might have explained their use are gone. We are reading a book from which most pages have been removed, and the pages that remain are the ones made of stone and metal, not the ones made of reed and clay. And yet even this incomplete record suggests more than the conventional narrative comfortably accommodates. The voltage is real, the focal length is real, the drill marks in diorite are real, the mathematical sophistication of the earlier Sumerian tablets is real, the linguistic isolation of the Sumerian language is real, the flood layers in the stratigraphy are real. The Sumerian self-description as restorers rather than inventors is documented across hundreds of surviving texts. None of these facts individually compels a revision of the standard timeline. Each one admits an ordinary explanation, but they persist collectively as a quiet pattern, a shape in the evidence that does not resolve into the smooth upward curve of gradual progress that our models prefer. Perhaps that curve is simply rougher than we have drawn it. Perhaps human technological development has always moved in waves rather than lines surging forward in certain places and periods, receding in others, losing ground to catastrophe, and recovering through the patient work of transmission and preservation. The scribble schools suggest this. The flood layers suggest this. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental sophistication at 9,500 BC, followed by apparent regression, suggests this most dramatically of all. If civilization is not a single ascending staircase, but a series of waves cresting, breaking, reforming, then the anomalies in the Mesopotamian record become less anomalous. They become expected features of a process that includes loss, as well as gain forgetting, as well as discovery restoration, as well as innovation. The Sumerians seem to have understood this. Their mythology is not the mythology of a culture celebrating its own genius. It is the mythology of a culture aware of its own fragility, a culture that built institutions specifically designed to prevent the loss of knowledge that framed its technical achievements as sacred inheritances, rather than personal accomplishments that maintained dead languages and ancient formulas across centuries of political upheaval, because it believed perhaps from experience that knowledge once lost might not be easily regained. The museum vaults are quiet at this hour. Temperature and humidity hold steady in the storage rooms where the artifacts rest in numbered drawers. The copper has aged to green. The clay has cracked along ancient stress lines. The iron rod, corroded by time and by whatever liquid once surrounded it, remains suspended in its original position, centered deliberate waiting. In an adjacent case, the crystal lens holds its curves smooth and patient, still capable of focusing light after more than 2,000 years. These objects do not argue. They do not insist. They simply exist, carrying within their materials the evidence of what someone once knew and what we have not yet fully understood. Outside, the night continues. The same stars that Sumerian astronomers tracked with such improbable precision turn slowly overhead, Venus tracing its familiar arc, the constellations holding their ancient patterns. Somewhere beneath the soil of southern Iraq, in layers not yet reached by any excavator's trench, other objects may wait in the darkness, other traces of knowledge that does not fit the timeline, other small stubborn fragments of a story older than the one we have agreed to tell. The sand is patient. It has kept its secrets for 5,000 years. It can wait a little longer for someone willing to listen. A clay jar, 13 centimeters tall, rests in a drawer somewhere behind a locked door. The copper inside it has turned the color of old verdigris, that particular green that metal takes on when it has been touched by acid, and then by centuries. The iron rod still hangs in its suspended position, corroded in bands where liquid once sat, held in alignment by an asphalt seal that has outlasted every empire that rose and fell above it. If you could hold it in your hand tonight, it would weigh almost nothing. A few 100 grams of clay and metal and dried bitumen, small enough to forget on a shelf, ordinary enough to catalogue without comment, and yet it carries in the quiet chemistry of its corrosion the trace of a reaction that our timeline did not expect to find in the ancient world. We have followed that trace tonight from the excavation trenches outside Baghdad to the storage rooms of the British Museum, from the flood layers at Ur to the limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe, from the sexagesimal tables of Sumerian scribble schools to the grid-planned streets of Mohenjo-Daro. We have held the evidence up to the light and turned it slowly, watching it catch different angles. Some of those angles suggest one thing, some suggest another. None of them resolve into a single clean image, and perhaps that is not a failure of the evidence, but a quality of it, the way that very old things pulled from very deep layers of earth tend to resist the simple stories we try to press them into. We do not know with certainty whether the copper and clay vessel was built as a battery. We do not know whether the Nimrod lens was ground for magnification or for beauty. We do not know whether the drill marks in diorite were made by tools we haven't found or by patience we have underestimated. We do not know whether the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from a world before the flood, or whether they simply developed it faster and more brilliantly than our models predict. These uncertainties are not gaps in the story. They are the story, the honest shape of what it looks like when you try to read a record that is 5,000 years old, written in materials that decay, in languages that died by hands that left no names. And that is enough. It is enough to notice that the questions exist. It is enough to sit with the discomfort of not knowing and to recognize that discomfort is something valuable, a reminder that history is not a finished document, but an ongoing excavation, and that every generation uncovers layers the previous one did not reach. The artifacts do not demand belief. They do not require you to choose a side. They ask only that you remain open to the possibility that the past is deeper and stranger, and more interrupted than the version we were taught in school, that human beings have been capable of extraordinary things for a very long time, and that some of those things may have been accomplished and lost and half-remembered and accomplished again, in cycles we are only beginning to recognize. Perhaps somewhere in the soil of southern Iraq, another vessel waits its copper, still holding the shape of a cylinder, its iron rod still suspended in darkness, its story still untold. Perhaps it has been waiting since before the flood layers were laid down. Perhaps it will wait a little longer. The sand does not rush. It holds what it holds until someone arrives with the patience and the willingness to ask what lies beneath. But that asking can wait until morning. Tonight the questions settle like fine dust on still water, present visible but no longer stirring. The museums are dark. The display cases hold